Hi, I'm Owen from Rask Australia. Thanks for tuning in to the Rask Network.
Before we get into today's show, there are a few things we have to go over.
Firstly, what you're about to hear and see is limited to general information only. It's not personal financial advice like you'd get from a financial planner. Also, it's important to remember that past performance is not indicative of future performance. That means that anything that's happened in the past, or we say today, is not necessarily going to reflect what happens in the future. Lastly, please consider that any of the guests or myself are featuring on this program may have a financial interest in some of the products or shares mentioned. That's enough from me. I hope you enjoyed today's program.
G'day, Kate. Welcome to this episode of the Australian Finance Podcast.
It's good to be back, Owen, and recording an episode in person, which is fantastic.
Yes. Not quite free of COVID in Melbourne, but we're doing a pretty good job so we can be back in the office. Today we're joined by a very special guest, Emma from the Broke Generation. How are you going?
Hey, I'm great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's wonderful to have you in person, as Kate said. We're hoping,
it is.
Because you're new to the show, maybe you can introduce yourself and what you do for our listeners.
My name's Emma. I run the Broke Generation, and I focus on helping people feel better about their finances so that they can build the confidence they need to do all the other things: save, invest, spend wisely, all that kind of stuff.
Mm. Yeah, it's such an important topic. We don't talk about it enough on the show, do we, Kate? Like, we don't talk about the relationship people have with money, the relationship people have with their spending. We talk about it like it's like a spreadsheet, right? Like this column is for wants, this one's for needs. And we probably don't get into that emotive side of it enough, right?
I know we talk about investing a lot on the show, but there's a lot of steps that come before it. As we were discussing off air before, you don't just go straight from where you are currently to investing. And I think that's why I really wanted to talk to you today, Emma, because I've followed you for quite a long time and listened to your podcast, and it really, it just approaches money and life holistically in a really different way to a lot of the podcasts, even us out there. So I'm really excited to dive into it all today.
Mm.
Yeah, me too. I talk about this stuff all day, and I could go on for hours. So how long have we got?
Yeah. Well, why don't we start with probably something that you might have spoken about a bit, but maybe it's one of those long versus short versions. How did you come to focus on this?
Yeah, so I think for me, it's a bit like you said, you don't just go from where you are to investing. From my perspective, I feel like some people do. Like they just, they're spending all their money and they know that they shouldn't be, or living paycheck to paycheck, or they get their first job or whatever, and they just kind of like plug the numbers into a system and it just works. And then at some point there's a surplus and they learn about investing. It's easier to do now more than ever with podcasts like this one. Whereas for me, I, knew I wanted to do something, sort my finances out. I knew that I was spending more than I should be and I was getting into debt, and I've mentioned this before, I thought that when I got a big girl full-time job, that would be enough, and it wasn't. And I think we kind of think that we can have everything we want, we're kind of advertising and that kind of thing, especially, back in like 10, 20 years ago. Advertising was kind of like, have everything. You need all these things. You need all this, stuff to look a certain way or whatever. I tried to do the budgeting thing, and I tried to split the wants and the needs. And I knew, obviously, on an intellectual level, that I didn't need 100 polyester dresses, but I wanted them, or I thought I needed them. But I knew intellectually that I needed to pay rent and I didn't need to buy clothes. And I would just keep trying to set a budget and start saving. And at this point, investing was not even in my mind, but I would just try and split that money and hold onto some money and keep some money. But it just didn't work because my spending and everything going on in my bank accounts was a symptom of other things. And I don't think that's true for everybody, but I think that the people it is true for really, like me included, struggle to take on other information because it's just not working. And then people get stuck in the cycle for life because they think there isn't enough. And don't get me wrong, for some people there really isn't. But sometimes it's because there's other things going on further back, and you can't keep money or invest money if you don't know how to manage it, and if your approach to attempting to manage it is a symptom of how you feel about something else.
Mm.
Yeah, and I think a lot of advertising makes us feel like we should have it all. And as soon as we get that full-time job, everything should just come to us on a silver platter. And I think that's often how we fall prey to buy now, pay later ads and credit card ads, where it's have it now, you deserve it. And I think that can often lead us astray because we end up going into debt. And I think you've had some experience sort of helping like yourself and your listeners get out of debt as well.
Yeah, debt for me, again, it was a symptom of many other things. And I think particularly as young women, I'm
sure it's true for people in their late teens and early 20s now, but definitely for me, like late 2000s. A lot of spending is a performance of femininity and womanhood and desirability by men at that time. You know, we dress a certain way to look thinner, to look taller. You know, we spend a lot of money on all of these things. And if you are dealing with a lot of those things, you can sort of ultimately disregard, particularly when you're young and you think you've got the rest of your life to figure it out, you can disregard how much it's impacting your finances because you're just trying to fix whatever lifestyle magazine or, you know, teen or adolescent magazine told you needed to fix at that time. Things are a lot more inclusive now, or getting that way, and we might, rather than reading about cellulite creams or whatever, we might learn about how to love ourselves, but on so many levels, particularly with buy now, pay later ads and all that kind of stuff. And there is a very much have it now, pay for it later, or have it now, deal with it later, or feel a certain way now and deal with it later. So yeah, that's how I got into debt. And to be honest, my debt spending was no different to any other spending. A lot of people, you know, go into debt because they were flying to Dubai or buying handbags, or there was none of that big stuff. It was just a combination of that symptom spending of mental health issues or you know, a bad relationship with myself as well as my money, and it being my emergency fund because I didn't have any savings. So even if I wasn't buying something because I deserved it because I'd had a bad day, because I was having a bad body image day or whatever, I would be fixing a flat tire with it because I didn't have any savings. I couldn't keep any money. And so investing in wealth creation was never even an option because I couldn't even hold on to any money to fix my tire, let alone invest or save.
Yeah. And going on from, as you mentioned, dealing with the symptoms, what are some of the strategies that worked for you, or you found work for other people as well along the journey to help build that better relationship with money, instead of it being potentially debt is your emergency fund, or you're using money to fill a emotional void, or where whatever reason you need to use the money?
Yeah, it's individual to everybody, and obviously your spending being a symptom of something, what that something is can be on a sliding scale, and in some cases there needs to be professional intervention. Obviously, we can't disregard that. And it's often difficult talking about it because I kind of tell my story and I go, and then I changed my habits and I did this. And people are going, how? And
just overnight.
Yeah, it's a lot of things, and it's a bit like the science of behavior change. There is this whole pre-contemplation stage where you are contemplating making change. It's been studied in smokers and people changing their diet and exercise habits and that kind of thing, and it's true for all kind of behavior change. You are in several stages before you actually make the change. And I think in that contemplation and pre-contemplation stage, you firstly need to make the link between how you feel about everything but money and your money, because often, you know, we don't think that. We think it's because there's not enough. It's because I've got kids. It's because I am on a low salary. It's because I live in London, or I live in Melbourne, or I live in Sydney, you know, and we kind of have these explanations, not excuses, but explanations for why our money is the way it is, and we don't ever connect it to anything else. So I think firstly, making that link and looking at where your money is and where your money is going, how much is coming in and how much is going out. Sounds basic, but not just how much you're spending, but where it's actually going, and, you know, going a bit deeper and, you know, okay, you bought a top. Okay, what was it, just a top, or were you trying to achieve something or feel a certain way? Or are you always spending at 5 o'clock on a Friday because you hate your job and you're drinking yourself into oblivion to forget about it? Like, it's common for a lot of people. And doing that when you live in a capital city is really expensive. And I mean, I had this experience. I had a job that made me quite unhappy when all my jobs have made me quite unhappy at some point. But you get into the culture. If you're in a environment where there's a culture of drinking, and it is the type of drinking where you're funding it yourself rather than office drinking, which is slightly more common in some industries. But I was out there drinking with like the CFO. He could afford it. I was on like equivalent $32,000 in London when it was like £12 for a glass of wine.
Wow.
You know, like, but when you are sort of in those environments, you know, sometimes it could be a symptom of being unhappy about something, or sometimes it can be a symptom of just the contextual life that you are living where your finances just don't match. And sometimes it can be, you know, a bit more logical, and there are, you know, maybe there are less feelings, but it's just that you're in an environment where your spending habits can't coexist with your finances. It can happen in friendship groups when, you've got doctors, lawyers, and then little old you on an advertising apprenticeship. It's not, we behave the same way, and we keep up with our peers. And I do think the keeping up with the Joneses behavior is a little bit more of our parents' generation. I don't personally feel like I've ever consciously done that, but the environments that we exist in mean that we not actively keep up, but just feel compelled to participate in the same types of hobbies, holidays, hen-dos.
So how do you find the balance then? Because that's like the key point. So you've recognized, you drew a line between kind of a symptom and spending. Then how do you find the balance? Like people say want to go for drinks on Friday night, Thursday night, whatever the thing might be.
Yeah, so I think that firstly, when you turn your awareness to it, you are instantly in a better place to change behavior. But there's a lot of, depending on what it is that's going on for you and what you're discovering, there's a lot of self-forgiveness, there's a lot of awareness that needs to happen, and sort of keeping your finger on the pulse of where your money's going. So it's not, you don't just draw a line and stop doing it anymore, but you draw a line where you stop ignoring it. And you might notice it, and it depending on how much true financial capacity you do have and what the actual problem is. But keeping engaged with it and really sort of, I think we often underestimate in all kinds of things how we actually make decisions about anything. There's a book by Mel Robbins, who has nothing to do with Tony Robbins, I've discovered. But I thought they were married at one stage, and I was like, ooh, because I really like her. But this feels irrelevant, but I swear it's relevant. She has a book called The 5-Second Rule, and it's about sort of compelling yourself to do things and finding motivation. But what she talks about in it is there's actually been so many studies done on the fact that we make decisions in a 5-second period, which, in the context of our day is quite short, but it's actually quite a long time. And actually noticing, we make decisions all the time. We make decisions to go to the bathroom before we record this podcast. We make decisions to wear a jacket, whether or not it's cold. Actually tuning into where your decisions are about spending or about going, to be in an environment where there would be spending. It sounds silly and it sounds like it wouldn't make a difference, but we do it without thinking. So when we start thinking, we're suddenly equipped to actually do things differently. And for me, again, it sounds really intangible, and it is, and it's a long process. But just starting to notice the amount of times you make a decision and what that decision is for, it does eventually compound into action.
And on the topic of emotional spending decisions that you mentioned before, I've definitely done that before. I've felt really upset or angry and just spent a lot out of this emotion, which it doesn't actually solve any problems, and it only makes you feel better for maybe 30 minutes. And then the next day you're really regretting it, and you're looking at your bank account because that didn't align with your goals, your spending goals, your budget for the month. How do you overcome that? And especially, where do you drive that emotion instead of just going out and spending when you have it?
It's funny how even years after I've started to tackle these behaviors, I still notice myself wanting to do that. I've had a difficult week, and all I wanted to do is go buy something because why not? But firstly, like I said, when you tune into decision making, you can actually start to have some kind of conscious awareness that that's what you're thinking, whereas previously you wouldn't really have thought about that, you would have just done it. But I also like to recommend that people sort of look at what it is that they're doing, because it's not just spending. You're either scrolling online, or you're thinking about going to a certain place, or looking at Pinterest. There's always a series of steps or thoughts that happen before you actually tap your card or enter your details, and it kind of comes from both sides. So firstly, putting obstacles in to make that a longer process. So small things like taking your Apple Pay off of your phone, or your I love Apple Pay. I do too, but I had to take it off because convenience spending was a really big thing for me. Having a bad day, I'm suddenly spending like $14 on a juice, and I'm like, oh, or in a acai bowl or something. So I had to take that off. But just small things, not saving your credit card details, putting those like logical obstacles in. There's a few sort of plugins and websites that you can block URLs from, which is really helpful on your work computer or whatever. If you're scrolling on certain websites, the Iconic or something like that, you can actually block them so you can't get into them. You need to have the self-control to not turn them back on again. But sometimes that can be helpful if that's something you find yourself doing. So putting those logical obstacles in, but then thinking about what the feeling is that you're trying to obtain and finding other ways to do that. So, it sounds all very lovely, and it's a lot more difficult in practice to actually do it. But yeah, when mine, I've said, was a lot about body image issues or my relationship with myself, or how I was feeling about who I am in the world that day. How can I treat that in other ways without buying clothes? And
I was going to ask you a question on that, which is very personal. Did you seek counselling or anything like that to help you through this?
I have since, but at the time I couldn't afford it, so no.
How did you go on that discovery? How did you discover all this about yourself?
I mean, I'm a very introspective person, Owen, as you might be able to tell. I don't know, really. I mean, I think if I were doing it now, I would probably approach it with a lot of the mindset tools that we have available, meditation, journaling, that kind of thing. But I didn't really have that. I did it quite... I love numbers as well, so I'm sort of both sides of that. But I did it with a lot of really getting... looking at those transactions and things like that, and really looking at what percentage of my money was going towards this feeling, and kind of thinking about that quite broadly. We set goals and we have a vision for what it is we're trying to achieve or why we're trying to get out of debt or whatever, but you can do it on the inverse as well. And sort of you're thinking about, when you set goals, you're thinking about what you want to achieve by doing these actions, but you can actually spend some time and write it out if that's your thing, thinking about what would happen, what's the reality you're avoiding, what is not your vision. And when you connect every time you tap your card to that, that vision of being 30 and still being in debt and everyone buying houses and you still paying off a credit card because of this feeling, you can sort of... it's almost like aversion therapy or something, I suppose, if I'm not a psychologist, but it sort of follows the similar principles. Expose yourself to the actual impact of your actions. Because like I said, I knew on an intellectual level that something was wrong. It's just finding ways to make yourself change them. And, however it is for you, I particularly connect to watching a savings account or something go up. So if I'm, giving up, for me, it was buying clothes. I couldn't just stop doing that and that be it. I needed to see the outcome of that, the good outcome of not doing it and the bad outcome of doing it. So whatever that looks like for whatever your vice is, I suppose, connecting to the actual long-term impact on the positive and the negative side.
Yeah, we had Nir Eyal on the show recently. He's a famous author out of the US and talks about getting traction towards long-term goals. But I've found doing this personally that it's easier to find counterpoints. This is what I don't want, not this is what I do want. I find that so much easier. And so casting your mind forward 5 years, being do I still want debt? Do I want my portfolio to look like this? Or whatever the case might be, whatever your money goal might be, what do you want it to be? Is probably a harder question than what don't I want it to be. Find what you don't want it to be and move away from that.
I'm the same, and that was really helpful for me as well, because it also helps when you start sort of making excuses for yourself to actually come up against yourself, because you might go, a lot of us have limiting beliefs around money, we might kind of go, oh yeah, but there's just not enough, or it's just giving up that won't make any difference. To actually say to yourself and pretend that you're someone saying to yourself, yeah, you're right, it won't. You can give that up, but it won't make any difference. We're naturally very defiant to things like that. So 1 minute we're going, nothing will change. It won't make any difference. I may as well just have this, dare I say it, latte or this top or go on that trip, or nothing will ever change. Okay, no, it won't. You happy with that? Nothing's ever going to change. Okay. And see how you actually buck up against that, because we're more defiant than we think we are, and we can kind of leverage that to make change.
How about then, so we talk about budgeting and spending a lot, and it always seems very negative. So it's always, I have to give up this, I have to do that. You mentioned about seeing your bank balance go up, which is for a lot of people very motivating. Well, how else can we make things, how can it be a good thing to budget? Get happiness from that process as well.
I tend, and I try to look at all stages of budgeting. Sometimes I'm in more of a everyday budget flirt. I'm not working towards any specific goal. I'm just sort of, some's going towards this, some's going towards that, some's going towards savings and investing or whatever. Other times I might be in a bit more of a push focus. So first of all, having various different types of budgeting where you do take the pedal off the gas a little bit can give you a bit of a break. But regardless of how hard you're going and how much capacity you actually have, thinking about making it something of opportunity and more organizing your money rather than like being on a budget, because the word budget doesn't, there's always the word budget is so commonly misused, because like travel on a budget, everybody should be traveling on some sort of budget, even if it's $1 million budget. You still got a budget, and everybody, even the richest people in the world, or your friends that have got more income than you or whatever, everybody's on some sort of budget. So don't sort of put yourself on one like it's a diet. More just consider it organizing your money, and that might be organizing your money to go towards lattes or clothes or travel. And then you might, don't forget that you don't just set it once and stick to it forever, because if it's making you miserable, it's probably not a very good one.
Yep.
How can you cut down the things that you don't like and allocate more to the things that you do like, even if that's really small? A lot of people kind of go, there's not enough for that. But in some small way, like what can you do to make it enjoyable in some way? Because it is seen as a diet and it is seen as cutting stuff out, but it's really just organizing your money.
Yeah. And with a bit more intention, because, it was on that Niall episode where he said, like, when you plan to waste time, it's not wasted time. Because, I feel a lot of guilt when I watch TV. I feel like I should be doing something more useful for my life. And I guess it can sometimes feel the same with spending. The coffee ones are just a common example, because there's always lots of fights in the finance community about whether that's a waste or not, and whether your coffee, if you cut them out, you'd have $1 million by the time you retire. But it's more just like, if that's what brings you joy and brings you happiness, spending with intention and putting money towards coffees rather than just doing it because everyone else at work bought a coffee that morning, so you did too, but you don't actually enjoy it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think a lot of the time budgets can, and this is something that I advocate for, a lot of the time budgets are kind of like paying your bills and then working out what's next, and then paying your savings and then what? Whereas actually adding in, whether it's separating into different savings pots or whatever, or sinking funds, or sometimes people call them, but adding in line items for things that you do want. And ideally there's more line items for things you do want than things you don't. We go, okay, I've got to set a budget. I've got to pay for my petrol and my bills and my this, and I'm going to save $100 and so I'm done. But it's like, no. Again, if you were planning your weekend, you want some free time, you wouldn't just you're going to think about what you want that free time for. Otherwise you're just stuck with nothing to do or no way to enjoy it. So I think being okay with adding things into your budget or spending plan or organization of money, rather than focusing on taking everything out, actually just add things in, because it also forces you to think about where you want your money to go. Because sometimes you would do it that sort of very basic level way and go, okay, my expenses are paid and my savings are paid and now I've got this. But that's where I was really going wrong, because I would do all that and that all made sense and I'd have this, and then I just have run out by Tuesday. I'm thinking, well, what am I doing wrong? But because I wasn't thinking, I just knew I had money to spend, however small that was, $20, $100, $200, but I wasn't thinking about where it would go. And so I did just get sucked up into my environment. Maybe I would get a coffee, maybe I would go to dinner, or I'd get to the end of the week and have not spent it and just spend it anyway on something I still didn't really want.
Yeah.
So not only adding things in, not only makes it actually better to organize your money and get clearer on what can actually coexist with other things, because we can't have everything and we are all on different incomes and there are different gaps between our income. But yeah, just forcing yourself to think about where you actually want it to go. And if you have got $40 left after you've done all of that, how can you maximize that? Because if you don't plan it, you might have run out by Tuesday but not got anything. Whereas if you do plan it, if someone, take that number. If that's all you had all week, what would you do to make the most of it? If you were going to die tomorrow and you're given that amount of money, what would you do with it? And then you know what you want. And then at least if you are only spending $50, either out of necessity or desire, or because you're planning or saving for something, at least you're getting the most mileage out of it you possibly can.
Didn't you do a $50 spending challenge recently
I
for
did.
a week? How did that go?
Well, remarkably well, because I thought about how can I maximize this? And I've sort of done them unintentionally before when trying to set a budget. And again, I just think, well, this isn't enough. I can't enjoy anything, can't do anything. But, there I was carrying in 3 meals into my co-working space on Friday because I knew that I wanted 20 of those $50 to go to beers at the football because not having a beer at the football felt so scarce to me. But eating my little tomato salad at work for lunch, I was fine because I would rather have that. And it is about optimization and maximizing what you have and getting the most mileage out of it rather than just, being a bit of a victim to prices of things, I suppose, especially at the moment.
Yeah, it's insane. And something on a more practical note, something I've really enjoyed watching on your end recently is your weekly spending reviews. And are you able to share some of the strategies that if listeners wanted to maybe review where they've spent their money at the end of each week and whether that was in line with their plan and whether that they got the most joy out of it, maybe some strategies that they could try?
Yeah, totally. My spending reviews are some of my favorite things to do because a lot of the time, people like me, I just said on this show, review your spending. So they go, okay. So they pull up their thing and they kind of go, well, can't do anything about that. That was groceries. And I massively used to do this because one of my toxic traits is going to the supermarket for one thing and leaving with 12. And so I would review my spending in a really basic way and be like, well, that's all groceries. I just don't earn enough money. I went in to get ingredients for dinner. What can I do? Whereas I wasn't actually looking behind those numbers and behind that store and thinking what was really, what's really happening here? How can I avoid that? So the way that I suggest that people do it firstly is to, before you've looked at any numbers, think about how you think that your spending went this week. Because again, I've noticed a lot from my spending reviews, I'll put up and go, I spent $195 this week on these things. And people go, that's loads. And I'm like, I'd add yours up. And often they're people I know and I know what they do for a living and I know how much they earn and I know what they spend on. Or I follow them online as well and I'm thinking, well, I know where you've been this weekend because you've been posting it all over Instagram. Add up what you spent and it's probably more than you think. So first of all, before you've done anything, actually ask yourself, how do you think it went? Are you happy with what you spent? Do you think you spent in alignment with your goals this week? And sometimes you'll go, yeah, I think I did. And then you'll open it up and be like, oh no, I didn't. Or other times you might have spent, an okay amount, but be thinking, I don't really get anything for it. So think about how you feel first before you look at the numbers. And then with each of the transactions, it helps to add a bit of context as well, and context more broadly as well. What was going on this week? Did you get, news that that rocked your entire world? But no, were you having a bad mental health week? Were you traveling? Was your mum visiting and you hadn't seen her for the first time in 3 years? What might give some context to what you're about to read. And then context per transaction as well, because that stops us just going, groceries. Was that meant to be a bunch of coriander and ended up being $50? Really thinking about that. And it also helps you kind of remember your life at the same time as well. Because, the weeks pass by and we don't know the difference between each one. But then sort of context and giving them a ranking out of either how necessary they were, if we're working with more needs, or if they are discretionary spends, how much value you got out of them, how aligned are they to your goals, how joyful were they, and rank them on a scale of 1 to 10 or color them in with highlighters if that's your vibe, and that gives you a heat map really of how much mileage you are getting out of your money. And it can be quite confronting, I think, especially it's really helpful if you are one of those people that feels like they earn good money and have nothing to show for it, because it will be those, wines you didn't really want. And 2 identical transactions can have completely different backstories. And if we're not looking at the context and we're not thinking about whether we enjoyed it or whether we really needed it or whether it was bringing any value to our lives, things can slip under the radar because we go, $21 for 2 Pinot Noirs, they're 2 identical transactions, but one, you're catching up with a colleague you haven't seen since pre-COVID and you're having the best time. And one, you just kind of got stuck there because you don't have any boundaries and you're a people pleaser and you couldn't leave. Me.
Sounds specific.
Could I be talking about myself? Or, you could have, there was just an alternative available to you. And so I think that helps you discern the difference between spending that should stay in your budget if it can, and spending that can come out. And that's when you get the most value out of reviewing your spending, because you literally free up money that you didn't want to spend in the first place. So you're not giving anything up, you're just reallocating money to somewhere else.
Yeah, that's such great advice. I think that's the big thing for optimizing a budget. It's like you don't need to necessarily sacrifice on happiness, right? So this is a very simple question. well, I say it's simple to ask. What's your number one tip for people improving their relationship with money?
It's going to be review your spending, and review it in detail as well. You know, you might want to add things into what I've said or take things out if they don't resonate with you, but just get really clear on where your money is going, because I think that, you know, even me who reviews my spending most weeks and publishes it online, I still learn something new every week, and I still, you know, you learn things about where you can free up money. You learn things about how your money is a symptom of other things, especially if, you know, I think it's probably more relatable to people that have struggled with money on a capacity level in the past, whereas some people haven't, and therefore they don't think that their money is ever a symptom of anything else, because there's always been, you know, enough. Yeah. So you don't really think about it. But I think that everybody can learn something from looking at where their money is going in the context of their lives.
Yeah, I think it's fantastic. And if people want to see how to actually do this in real life and how you spend your money each week, if they want to have a bit of a nosy, your Instagram handle
it is _broke generation. The broke generation was taken, unfortunately, but it's not in use, which is frustrating. But yeah, it's interesting as well, and I wish more people would talk about it. I mean, obviously nobody has to, but it's also really, a lot of people who say when they watch it, like, oh, this has made me feel so much better, because I'm watching you and you saying you are saving and you are investing and you are hitting your goals and you are, you know, running your business and that kind of thing, and you're still able to do all of these things. But I'm also not, you know, it's also a very average amount of money. I'm not spending, a lot of the time people that do reveal their spending will become like, how much I spent on my Chanel bags, and you're like, that's nice for you. But you know, how much value you can get out of $200. And like, you know, a bit like we were saying the other day, a couple of people are saying, oh, I'm not really into like clothes and drinking. And a couple of other people are like, oh, I'm really into clothes and drinking. And it's like, great. It's prioritization, I guess.
Yeah. We'll put all the links in the show notes too, to that, as well as your podcast, which we'll call out. So Get Behind Emma's podcast if you haven't already listened. We're talking about how it all comes together behind the scenes, and we know it's you're a few months ahead of time as well.
I am. I do. I like to batch create.
Yeah, batch create. We should take that on board, Kate.
Yes.
Rather than being last minute. I'm sure Monique would appreciate that. No, but Emma, thank you for taking some time to join Kate and I on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been very enjoyable. I hope I haven't rambled on too much.
Not at all. It's wonderful. I'm looking forward to having you back. And Kate, as always, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for listening, everyone.